It was supposed to be just another panel. The nation tuned into the primetime special titled, Truth and Transparency, Voices of America, featuring political strategist Kash Patel and legendary actor Denzel Washington. It was a rare pairing, intentional by the producers to spark conversation. What they got instead was fire. The set gleamed under bright studio lights, the crowd already humming with anticipation. Denzel, clad in a classic charcoal suit, radiated calm. He wasn't there for drama. He was there to speak on unity, integrity, and responsibility in leadership. Kash, however, seemed to enter the stage with a chip on his shoulder. From the start, he cut Denzel off mid-sentence. When the moderator asked about institutional trust and leadership accountability, Denzel spoke first, measured, eloquent. Leadership, he said, should be earned through consistency, not chaos. Truth doesn't shout. It endures. Kash chuckled, loud enough for everyone to hear. Here we go, he muttered, not under his breath. The moderator, sensing tension, tried to shift gears. Mr. Patel, your thoughts. Kash leaned forward, the corners of his mouth twitching. I didn't realize we invited an actor to teach us about reality. Maybe next time we should bring a magician too. A few scattered gasps. A few awkward laughs. But Kash wasn't finished. He turned directly to Denzel. You're not in a movie now, he sneered. This isn't training day. So take off the fake wisdom and go back to reading scripts. Silence fell like a curtain. The air was electric, thick with disbelief. But Denzel? He didn't blink. Denzel didn't flinch. He didn't scowl. He didn't smile. He just waited. The silence made Kash shift in his chair, as if expecting a flash of anger. But Denzel leaned in slowly, adjusting the microphone before speaking in a voice so even, so controlled, it cut sharper than any insult. You know, Denzel began, my mother used to say, when someone shows you their character before they even know your name, don't argue. Let them keep showing it. A ripple went through the audience. He continued, you called me fake. That's fine. But I've spent over 4 decades studying people. Real people. Soldiers. Fathers. Addicts. Preachers. I've walked through prisons, hospitals, and neighborhoods most politicians wouldn't dare step into without a camera crew. His tone never shifted. It wasn't a clapback. It was a surgical strike, delivered with grace. I don't pretend to be a politician. I don't want that job. But don't mistake being measured for being weak. Because what I won't do, is stoop to tearing people down to get applause. Kash opened his mouth but couldn't find a foothold. The moderator looked stunned. And Denzel wasn't finished yet. He added, you wanted noise. I brought perspective. And I hope America's watching closely, because there's a difference. Then he leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and looked Kash dead in the eyes, calm as ever. The room erupted. But Denzel didn't react. He just sat there, still. The moment the clip hit the airwaves, social media ignited like a wildfire in dry brush. Within minutes, Denzel was trending worldwide. News outlets scrambled to analyze the exchange. Pundits across networks played the footage on loop, Denzel's poised response juxtaposed with Kash's smirk slowly fading in real time. On Twitter, hashtags like #ComPower and #DenzelEffect flooded the feed. One viral post read, Kash Patel tried to throw a punchline. Denzel built a legacy and hit back with legacy-level composure. That's how you respond to noise, with class. Even late-night hosts couldn't ignore it. Trevor Noah quipped, Kash brought a knife to a philosophy lecture. And Denzel turned it into a masterclass on restraint. But the most surprising reaction came from inside the political sphere. A Republican congressman tweeted, you don't have to agree with Denzel's politics, but you can't deny the man understands dignity better than half of Washington. Meanwhile, Kash Patel remained silent. No tweets. No interviews. No follow-up. Some said he was regrouping. Others said he'd been told to back off, privately. Behind closed doors, producers at the network were scrambling. Sponsors were torn. Some wanted to capitalize on the attention, others threatened to pull support. But one thing was undeniable: Denzel hadn't just shut down an insult. He'd reframed the entire discussion. And people weren't just watching, they were listening. 3 days later, Denzel received a call, but it wasn't from Hollywood. It came from Capitol Hill. The House Committee on Civic Discourse and Public Trust, a bipartisan group rarely seen in the spotlight, extended an unexpected and very public invitation. We would be honored to have Mr. Denzel Washington speak on the topic of public leadership, unity, and constructive dialogue in American life. It wasn't symbolic. It was official. Even major networks covered the announcement. CNN called it a cultural moment disguised as a political invitation. Fox News simply said, unexpected. But timely. At first, Denzel declined. He didn't want the spotlight for a soundbite. He didn't want to become a mascot for decorum. But something changed when he read a letter. It was handwritten, from a high school teacher in Detroit. She wrote, "I played your response for my civics class. We talked for an hour afterward. Not about politics, about character. I've never seen them sit that still." Denzel agreed to appear. But he had conditions. No script. No pre-approved questions. No handlers. Just a podium and a room of lawmakers from both sides. When he arrived in Washington, there were no red carpets, no flashing lights. Just the quiet murmur of anticipation as he stepped into a packed congressional chamber. And as he took the podium, the room stood. Not because they had to. But because they wanted to. The room was so quiet, you could hear the gentle scrape of Denzel adjusting the mic. He looked out over the sea of lawmakers, some seasoned, some newly elected, many visibly unsure of what to expect from a man best known for commanding movie screens, not congressional halls. He began slowly. "I'm not here as a celebrity. I'm not here to campaign. I'm not here to make you clap. I'm here because something broke on that stage last week, and it wasn't my pride. It was our standard." Heads tilted. Pens froze mid-note. You can't legislate decency. You can't draft bills that make people listen when it's easier to shout. But you can choose every day, especially in leadership, to raise the tone, instead of lowering it for applause. He glanced around the room, letting the words settle like dust on polished oak. "See, I grew up in a neighborhood where respect wasn't given for what you owned. It was given for how you acted when no one owed you a thing." Scattered nods. "The insult I got the other night? That wasn't new. That's noise. What's dangerous is when we start rewarding that noise with platforms. When decency becomes a punchline and cruelty becomes currency." The chamber was still. He finished with a pause, not dramatic, but weighty. "If I, a man trained to memorize lines, can show up without a script and speak from truth, then surely the people elected to lead this country can do the same." He stepped back. No music. No applause signs. And yet, every single person stood. Even those who didn't agree with a single thing he'd said, they stood. Because in that moment, it wasn't about politics. It was about presence. For nearly a week, Kash Patel had gone silent. No posts. No podcast appearances. No snide remarks on cable panels. Many assumed he was laying low, waiting for the moment to reclaim the spotlight with his usual firebrand flair. But when he finally reappeared, it wasn't on a political show. It was on a live stream from a small studio in Virginia, no makeup, no flashy intro, just a worn leather chair and a surprisingly somber tone. He looked tired. Almost human. First off, he said, clearing his throat, let me say something I don't usually say, I got it wrong. Viewers blinked. So did the hosts. He continued. I took a cheap shot at someone who didn't deserve it, not because I disagreed with his views, but because I didn't have a real answer. I used mockery because it was easier than honesty. And I paid for that. The host stayed silent, unsure whether this was a setup. But Kash didn't veer off. I watched that moment back, probably 20 times. And I realized something, I was loud. But he was clear. And the country heard the difference. Clips of the live stream spread quickly. Commentators from both sides reacted, some skeptical, others surprised. But for the first time in years, Kash Patel had delivered a message that didn't end with a jab or a headline. It ended with, I won't pretend we agree. But next time we sit across from each other, if there is a next time, I'll come with substance, not spite. It wasn't an apology wrapped in spin. It was simple. Direct. Unscripted. And perhaps, that made it hit even harder. The next morning, Denzel's phone buzzed. It wasn't his agent. It wasn't a journalist. It was a message forwarded from his assistant, short, unpolished, and direct. If you're willing, I'd sit down with you. No cameras. Just a real talk. Denzel didn't reply right away. He read the message. Then read it again. And instead of giving an answer, he did what he always did first, he thought. 2 days later, in a quiet corner of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, a private room was cleared. No press. No social media updates. Just 2 chairs, a pot of coffee, and 2 men who'd seen the country take sides over a 10-minute exchange. Kash arrived first, no entourage, no notes. Denzel walked in soon after, his presence just as steady as ever. They shook hands. Firm. Level. And then, silence. Until Denzel finally broke it. You didn't need to say anything. But you did. Kash looked up. That wasn't strategy. That was regret. Then let's make something out of it. What followed was not a debate. It wasn't even a reconciliation. It was a conversation. 2 hours of unfiltered, uncomfortable, and ultimately honest dialogue about truth, tone, leadership, and legacy. No one was converted. No one was cancelled. They just listened. By the time they stood to leave, there were no cameras waiting. No tweets pre-written. Just a quiet mutual nod, not of agreement, but of respect earned the hard way. And that night, Denzel made one final public statement before stepping back from the whirlwind: America doesn't need louder voices. It needs better ones. We start by talking like people, not performers. And for once, almost nobody argued. Weeks passed. The headlines faded. The hashtags slowed. But something strange happened. The moment didn't die. It evolved. Clips of Denzel's speech to Congress were added to public school curriculums under a unit called Modern Civic Dialogue. A university in Georgia launched a seminar titled Restraint and Resolve in Public Life. And in coffee shops, classrooms, and community centers, people started referencing the Denzel moment as shorthand for choosing composure over chaos. The irony? Neither Denzel nor Kash chased the aftermath. Denzel returned to his foundation, quietly funding mentorship programs in underserved cities. Kash kept his distance from cable brawls and began meeting with veterans and civil service workers to understand what he once dismissed as performative unity. In one small town in Ohio, a city council meeting opened with an unusual motion: before we debate tonight, I'd like us to replay the Denzel response. Just to remind us why we're here. The room agreed. It didn't change every heart. It didn't fix every divide. But it planted a seed, one rooted not in silence, but in how we speak when the world's watching. Years later, when asked about that infamous exchange, Denzel simply said, "Sometimes, you don't win by shouting louder. You win by not needing to shout at all." And just like that, what started as a televised insult became a national lesson in grace under fire. Though the public story had wrapped, behind the cameras, the ripple effect continued to grow in ways few anticipated. At a staff retreat in a major network newsroom, a senior producer held up a phone and replayed the moment Denzel responded to Kash, not to dissect it, but to challenge her team. "This is how you hold a moment without blowing it up. Let's start highlighting restraint instead of rewarding conflict." In Washington, a quiet shift was taking place. A bipartisan group of younger lawmakers began organizing closed-door listening sessions, not for the press, not for leverage, but to hear one another without the noise. They called it the dialogue table, inspired, in part, by Denzel's meeting with Kash. Meanwhile, in high schools across the country, student debate clubs began using a new rule called the Denzel Rule. If a member used a personal attack or sarcasm, they had to pause, reset, and reframe the point with respect. Not everyone liked it. But everyone remembered it. And in private, Kash's team noticed something else, a shift in his approach. He no longer interrupted panelists. He no longer led with mockery. He still held firm beliefs, but he began to ask questions before throwing punches. It wasn't a reinvention. It was a recalibration. One night, after a town hall in Texas, a young man approached him and said, "You were wrong that night. But the way you came back. That mattered to me. My dad watched it. We talked for the first time in months." Kash didn't have a speech ready. He just nodded. Sometimes, humility speaks louder than words. 5 years later. No one remembered the exact date. But they remembered the moment. College commencement speakers still referenced it. Leadership seminars studied it. And in a small museum exhibit on American civic discourse, a glass case held two simple items side by side, a printed transcript of Denzel Washington's congressional remarks. And a handwritten letter, framed, from Kash Patel, dated weeks after their private meeting. It read, "Sometimes losing the room teaches you more than winning it. Thank you for teaching me how to listen without needing the last word." By then, Denzel had stepped almost completely out of the spotlight, dedicating himself to mentoring young men in underserved communities, not for cameras, but because he believed in legacy that lives quietly. He rarely did interviews. But in one rare appearance, when asked about that night with Kash, he paused, smiled softly, and replied, "The moment wasn't about me. It was about what we all allow into our tone, our leadership, our living rooms. I just happened to be the one who stood still when others tried to shout." As for Kash Patel, he never became a senator. He never hosted a major show. But he did something more surprising. He started a nonprofit focused on civil dialogue and open debate for young professionals entering politics, military, and media. No agenda. Just one rule: you can disagree with someone's views. But you don't get to erase their humanity. And across the country, in classrooms, churches, town halls, and dinner tables, the message lived on. Not because it was viral. But because it was earned. A moment that began with an insult ended with a nation learning something rare: dignity is not weakness. It's leadership. Years passed. The nation had seen louder moments. More dramatic showdowns. Scandals. Outbursts. Walkouts. But none stayed with people quite like the night Denzel didn't raise his voice. In a media era dominated by clips built to provoke, one clip endured for a different reason: it calmed. It reminded people what adulthood looked like in a room full of ego. What strength looked like when it didn't need to flex. Scholars would later call it the Denzel Doctrine, a reference point for leadership courses and civic ethics programs across the country. What it stood for was simple: hold your ground. Don't trade truth for applause. And never let insult pull you out of integrity. A quote from Denzel eventually found its way engraved into a university's new debate hall: "You don't lead people by being louder. You lead by being worth listening to." Kash Patel was there for the unveiling. Not as a guest of honor. Not as a speaker. He stood quietly in the back, hands in his pockets, watching students take the stage under that quote. Not to tear each other down, but to listen, to truly engage. And in that moment, he nodded once. A subtle gesture. Almost unseen. But if you caught it, you'd understand. Because the real legacy wasn't about who won. It was about what followed. A conversation that never made headlines, but changed the way people chose to speak. Years later, at a national forum titled "Leadership in the Age of Noise," the host opened with a surprising statement: "Tonight's panel was inspired not by a bill, not by a political event, but by a single moment of silence between two men who could have become enemies, and chose not to." The audience nodded, many already familiar with that moment. What no one expected, was that both men had agreed to appear. Denzel Washington and Kash Patel, seated on the same stage again, this time, not to spar, not to perform, but to reflect. No podiums. No fanfare. Just two chairs. And as the moderator opened with a simple question: "What changed you?" Both paused. Kash went first. It wasn't just Denzel's words. It was the fact that he didn't take the bait. "I realized I wasn't fighting an opponent. I was exposing myself." That silence. It held up a mirror. Denzel followed. "People think the hardest part is staying calm. But the hardest part is staying clear on who you are when someone's trying to erase that." I didn't respond for me. I responded for the young man watching, wondering if dignity still means anything. A hush swept through the crowd, not of discomfort, but of recognition. What began as a televised insult had become a roadmap. Of how to turn fire into focus. How to lead without shouting. How to meet disrespect with resolve, not revenge. And when the evening ended, neither man shook hands for the cameras. They did it off stage. Quietly. Like old friends who had walked through something heavier than politics. Because the moment that stunned the nation wasn't about politics at all. It was about character. And long after the hashtags faded, that's what people remembered. Not who spoke loudest. But who stood still, and spoke last.